Brothers and sisters, we are living in a time where everything seems uncertain. Our lives are marked by trials, struggles, and sometimes even confusion. We are often quick to look at the world around us, to see what we can touch, to measure what we can see. We long for clarity, we long for understanding, but sometimes God is working in ways that are hidden from our eyes. Let us be clear about something: the Lord is never idle. He is never absent. Though you may not always see His hand at work, He is always at work orchestrating His perfect plan. There is no moment in time when God is not working for the good of His people. This is a truth that should give us great hope and comfort. When we are tempted to think that our circumstances are the result of mere chance, when we are troubled by the events unfolding in our lives, we must remember that God is working behind the scenes. He is sovereign over all things. Just because you cannot see Him does not mean He is not there. Just because you cannot trace His hand does not mean He is not guiding you. He is not distant, He is not asleep, and He is not unaware. Every moment of your life, from the grandest victories to the smallest struggles, is being used by Him for His purposes. Every difficulty you face, every tear you shed, every burden you bear, all of it is being used for your growth, for your sanctification, for the glory of His name. Think of the great men and women in Scripture. Think of Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers. At the time, Joseph could not understand why it was happening, but God was working behind the scenes. In the midst of betrayal, in the depths of a foreign prison, God was shaping Joseph to be a man who would save nations. Think of David running for his life from Saul. Though it seemed that everything was falling apart, God was working behind the scenes, preparing David to be the king of Israel, a king after God's own heart. Consider the Apostle Paul, imprisoned for his faith. It seemed like the end, but it was just the beginning of something far greater. God was at work behind the scenes, spreading the gospel through his imprisonment in ways that Paul could never have imagined. And then think of Christ Himself. When He was crucified, it looked like defeat. It looked like the end. But in reality, God was working behind the scenes, bringing about the greatest victory the world has ever known. In the darkest moment of human history, God was accomplishing His most glorious work. We often ask the question, why is this happening to me? And we wonder, where is God in all of this? But we must trust that He is sovereign. Even when we cannot see it, God is working. Even when we do not understand it, God is moving. His plan is far greater than anything we could ever grasp, and His purposes will always be accomplished. So do not lose heart. Trust in the One who works all things together for good. You may not always see His hand, but you can always trust His heart. Let us rest in the promise that God is working behind the scenes, and though we may not see it now, we will one day see it clearly. When that day comes, we will understand, and we will fall before Him in awe, praising Him for His perfect plan. Until then, let us walk by faith, knowing that God is never absent, never idle, and always at work in the lives of His people. God's sovereignty is the foundation of our faith and the lens through which we must view every aspect of our lives. It is easy to overlook or forget in moments of struggle, when we are faced with difficulties that seem senseless or overwhelming. But the truth remains, God is always in control, working behind the scenes in ways that we often cannot perceive. His sovereignty means that there is nothing that happens in this world, whether good or bad, that is outside of His will and purpose. This is a profound truth that should bring both comfort and awe to every believer. When we think of God's sovereignty, we must remember that it is not a distant, detached sovereignty. It is active and involved in every detail of our lives. Nothing is too small, too insignificant, or too trivial for God's sovereign will. The events that we consider mundane or unimportant, the struggles that seem unworthy of attention, the moments of silence when we feel abandoned, God is in all of them, working for His glory and our good. His sovereignty is not merely a doctrine to be learned, it is a reality to be lived out every day. In every circumstance, He is at work, even when we do not recognize His hand. This truth is especially significant when we go through times of hardship. It is easy to question God's sovereignty in those moments. We wonder, why is this happening to me? Or why is God allowing this? But instead of seeing the trial as evidence of God's absence or His lack of care, we must learn to see it as a moment in which He is actively shaping us. God's sovereignty does not promise a life free from pain or difficulty. Rather, it assures us that He is using those very challenges to refine us and fulfill His purposes in our lives. There are moments when the road seems long, the journey overwhelming, and the weight of suffering too much to bear. But in those very moments, God's sovereignty is still in action. Consider the story of Joseph. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, betrayed, thrown into prison, and forgotten, his life seemed to be one misfortune after another. If Joseph had only seen his circumstances in isolation, he might have concluded that everything was out of control, that God had abandoned him. But the reality was far different. God was using every single event to prepare Joseph for his future role in saving nations. When Joseph finally stood before his brothers, he declared, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." He saw the bigger picture. The sovereign hand of God had been at work behind the scenes all along, even when he couldn't see it. This is the same God who is working in your life right now, even if you cannot see how. The sovereignty of God is not just about his power to control circumstances, but about his wisdom in doing so. He knows what is best for us, and he is always moving us toward his perfect will, even when the path is unclear. This means that every trial, every challenge, every hardship is under his sovereign control. Nothing is wasted in God's kingdom. Every tear, every moment of suffering, every unanswered prayer has a purpose in his divine plan. And we must trust that he knows better than we do what is truly for our good. Sometimes it feels like God's plans are hidden from us, and we struggle to understand why things happen the way they do. But we must remember that God's ways are higher than ours. His understanding is beyond our comprehension. In Isaiah, God reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." There will be moments when we don't understand why things are unfolding the way they are. We may question God's timing or wonder why he allows certain things to happen. But this is where faith comes in. To trust in God's sovereignty means trusting that he is good, that he is wise, and that he is working all things for our ultimate good, even when we cannot see it or understand it in the moment. We must also understand that God's sovereignty is not a passive force, it is active and purposeful. God is not merely watching things unfold from a distance, he is actively involved in the details of our lives. He knows our hearts, our struggles, and our weaknesses. He understands the deepest desires of our souls. And in his sovereignty, he is working in ways we cannot always perceive to draw us closer to him, to sanctify us, and to conform us into the image of his Son. His sovereignty is not only about his control over the universe, but also his intimate involvement in our individual lives. As we trust in God's sovereignty, we are called to surrender our own understanding and our own desires. When we face challenges, we must remind ourselves that God's sovereign plan is always better than anything we could have imagined for ourselves. It is in trusting his sovereignty that we find peace in the midst of chaos, strength in the face of weakness, and hope in the midst of despair. God is working behind the scenes, and his work is perfect even when it is hidden from our eyes. His sovereignty assures us that no matter what we face, he is with us, he is for us, and he will bring his perfect plan to completion in his time. In times of uncertainty, it is easy for our faith to waver. We are human, and our perspective is limited by what we can see, feel, and experience. When things are going well, when we can clearly see the fruits of our labor or the blessings in our lives, it is easy to trust in God's sovereignty. But when everything seems to be falling apart, when it feels like we are stuck in a never-ending struggle, our faith is tested. This is when the truth of God's sovereignty becomes even more vital for us to grasp. We are called to trust not only when we can see God's hand, but also when we cannot see it at all. When we speak of trusting God's timing, it is not just about waiting patiently for things to fall into place. It is about understanding that God's timing is perfect, that his delays are not denials, and that his plans for us are always unfolding in ways that are beyond our comprehension. It can be frustrating when we face delays, when we feel like we are not moving forward, or that our prayers are going unanswered. We live in a world that demands instant gratification, and waiting on God's timing can feel like an arduous task. But we must remember that God's timing is always right, and his delays are not indications that he has forgotten us or that he does not care. God is not bound by time in the way that we are. He is eternal, outside of time and space, and his plans are unfolding on an eternal scale. When we feel like we are waiting for something to change, we must remember that God is already in the future, orchestrating events and preparing us for what is to come. His timing is never early, and it is never late. It is always right. And though we may not understand it at the moment, we are called to trust that he knows what he is doing. In fact, it is often in the waiting that we experience some of the most profound growth in our faith. Think about the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. God had promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, but it took 40 years of wandering before they reached the promised land. For 40 years they struggled and their faith was tested. They didn't understand why they had to wait so long. They grumbled, they questioned, and they doubted God's faithfulness. But through that time of waiting, God was refining them. He was teaching them to trust in His provision, His power, and His plan. His timing was not their timing, but it was perfect. And when they finally entered the promised land, they could look back and see how God had been preparing them for that moment all along. Similarly, when we are waiting on God, we may not understand why things are taking so long or why we are being asked to endure such difficulties. But we must trust that God is at work, even when we cannot see it. We are being refined in the process, and God is shaping us for the future that He has prepared for us. It is in the waiting that we learn to rely on Him, to lean into His sovereignty, and to trust that His timing will always be perfect. Furthermore, it is important to recognize that God's timing is not just about us as individuals. It is about His larger plan for His kingdom and His glory. When we pray, we often focus on our own desires and our own needs, but God is working in the grander scope of His eternal purposes. What may seem like a delay in our lives could be part of a much larger story that we cannot yet see. God is aligning events, preparing hearts, and orchestrating situations to bring about His perfect will in ways that we cannot fully comprehend. We must trust that our story is just one piece of a greater tapestry that God is weaving. His timing is always in alignment with His eternal purposes, and while we may not understand all the details, we can trust that He is good, faithful, and wise in His planning. The delay is not a sign of abandonment. When God seems silent, when He seems distant, it is not because He has forgotten us. It is because He is working behind the scenes in ways that we cannot yet see. He is preparing us, and He is preparing the world around us for His next move. We must not lose heart during the waiting seasons. They are not seasons of inactivity, but rather seasons of preparation. As we trust God's timing, we can rest in the knowledge that He is always working, always refining, and always moving us toward His perfect plan for our lives. When we talk about trusting God's timing, we also have to consider the reality of God's eternal perspective. Our time on earth is fleeting, but God's plan stretches into eternity. Our understanding of time is limited to the present moment and the brief span of our lives. But God sees the beginning from the end, and He is orchestrating events not just for our benefit, but for His eternal glory. This is why we can trust His timing even when it doesn't align with our own expectations. When we learn to trust in His timing, we align ourselves with His eternal purposes, and we gain peace in knowing that He is working everything for good, even when we cannot see it. In moments of waiting, let us remember the ultimate truth: God is never late, He is never early, and His timing is always perfect. His purposes are greater than ours, and He is working behind the scenes to bring about something far beyond what we can imagine. In trusting His timing, we learn to rest in His sovereignty and find peace in knowing that everything is in His hands. We live in a world that often prioritizes immediate results. Everything around us is built to bring instant gratification, from the technology we use to the systems that govern our lives. In this world of right now, the idea that God's work might unfold slowly or hidden from our eyes can be difficult to accept. We long to see immediate progress, to understand why things are happening, to understand how our lives are fitting into God's larger plan. But this is where faith must take root. Faith, at its core, is the belief that God is working in ways we cannot always see, and that He is fulfilling His purposes in ways that often remain hidden from our view. In the midst of life's challenges, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that God is at work behind the scenes. When we are struggling with sickness, financial difficulties, or personal challenges, we may feel abandoned or isolated. But God is always at work, even when we cannot see Him. His work is not limited by our understanding or by our circumstances. While we may only see a small piece of the puzzle, God sees the full picture. His plan is unfolding, and every moment, every situation, is a part of that greater plan. He is not caught off guard by our trials. He is not distant from our suffering. He is actively involved in every detail of our lives, working behind the scenes to bring about His perfect will. Take, for instance, the story of Esther. Here was a young woman who found herself in an extraordinary set of circumstances. She was taken from her home, placed in a royal palace, and eventually became queen. On the surface, it might have seemed like her rise to power was a result of chance or circumstance. But as the story unfolds, we see that God was working behind the scenes. He placed Esther in the royal palace for a specific purpose: to save her people from destruction. And though God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther, His hand is evident throughout the entire story. God was at work in the seemingly mundane details of Esther's life, arranging events, placing people in the right positions, and orchestrating everything to bring about his plan of deliverance for the Jewish people. In the midst of her circumstances, Esther may not have understood the greater purpose, but God was working behind the scenes, and his plan came to fruition in ways she could never have imagined. Similarly, in our lives, there are often things happening that we cannot see or understand. God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are beyond our comprehension. But we can take comfort in the fact that he is always at work. We may be facing difficulties, setbacks, or even failure, but God is using those moments to prepare us for something greater. His work is not always immediate or obvious. Sometimes it requires patience. It requires trust. It requires us to believe that God is working even when we cannot see it. This brings us to the second truth. God's work behind the scenes is not just about our individual lives, it's about his eternal purposes. We often focus on what we can see in the here and now. We want answers to our immediate struggles, and we want them quickly. But God is working on a much larger scale. His plan is not limited to our personal lives, it stretches across time and eternity. The difficulties we face today may have ramifications that extend far beyond our understanding. God's work in us and through us is not just about what happens in the short term, but about his eternal kingdom. When we face trials, we are often focused on the immediate outcome. How can we fix this? How can we resolve this problem? How can we move forward? But God's focus is not always on the immediate. His focus is on the eternal. He is working behind the scenes in ways that may not become clear until much later. Think of the early Christians who faced persecution and suffering for their faith. At the time, it seemed like the church was under attack, that the gospel was being silenced. But what they could not see in the moment was that through their suffering, the gospel was spreading to the ends of the earth. What looked like defeat was actually God's plan for the expansion of his kingdom. In the same way, we must trust that God's plan is bigger than our present circumstances. He is working in the lives of countless people, shaping hearts, transforming communities, and spreading his love in ways we may never fully understand. We may never see the full impact of our lives and our actions, but that does not mean that God is not at work. Our faithfulness in the small, hidden things is part of a much larger story that God is writing. We may never see the full extent of how our lives fit into his eternal purposes, but we can trust that they do. Finally, God's work behind the scenes is ultimately for his glory. This is the greatest truth we can cling to. Everything that God does, every action he takes, is ultimately for the glory of his name. When we face trials, when we endure suffering, it is not just about us, it is about his glory. We are called to trust that everything good or bad is being used to bring glory to God. This can be difficult to accept, especially in times of hardship. We want to understand why we are suffering, why things are happening the way they are. But the ultimate purpose of everything is to bring glory to God. The Apostle Paul reminds us in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This means that even in the darkest moments, God is working for our good and for his glory. We may not understand how, but we can trust that God's ultimate purpose is to make himself known and to bring glory to his name. Every trial, every hardship is an opportunity for us to reflect his glory. And though we may not see the immediate result, we can trust that God is working behind the scenes to accomplish his eternal purposes. In the end, when we look back on our lives, we will see that God has been at work all along. Even in the moments when we felt abandoned, when we questioned his goodness, when we could not see his hand at work, he was there, working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail to bring about his perfect plan. It is easy to find ourselves asking why things happen the way they do, especially when we find ourselves in seasons of struggle, loss, or hardship. Often, our immediate reactions to difficulties are rooted in frustration, confusion, or doubt. We may feel lost in the moment, unable to understand why something is happening to us. Yet the Bible reminds us over and over again that God is never absent from our lives. His plan is always unfolding, and his purposes are far greater than what we can see in the present. This is where the truth of God working behind the scenes becomes so crucial for us as believers. Even when we cannot see the full picture, we are called to trust that God is at work, and his work is always purposeful. One of the most comforting aspects of God's sovereignty is that he is always in control, even when our circumstances seem chaotic. We often try to take control of our own lives, striving to solve problems or find solutions on our own. But in doing so, we can lose sight of the fact that God is orchestrating everything according to his perfect will. Whether we are facing a personal crisis, a relational challenge, or a global issue, we are reminded in Scripture that God is in control of all things. His sovereignty is not just a theological concept, it is a living truth that we can rely on in every moment. It is not our job to see the whole picture or to fix every problem. Our role is to trust that God is working behind the scenes, even when we can't see how things will turn out. He is orchestrating every detail, every moment, and every circumstance for His glory and our good. The truth that God is working behind the scenes is not just something we understand in a theoretical sense, it is something we experience in our daily lives. Think of the story of Abraham and Sarah. They were promised a child by God, but after years of waiting, they saw no sign of this promise being fulfilled. They struggled with doubt, and in their impatience, they tried to take matters into their own hands by having a child through Sarah's servant, Hagar. While their actions were a result of their own lack of trust, we can see that God was still faithful to His promise. Even though the wait was long and filled with hardship, God was at work behind the scenes, preparing them for the fulfillment of His promise. When Isaac was finally born, it was clear that God had been working all along and His timing was perfect. The story of Abraham and Sarah teaches us that God's promises are not dependent on our ability to understand or control the circumstances, they are dependent on His faithfulness. Even in their impatience and doubt, God was working behind the scenes, bringing about His plan in His perfect time. God's timing is often one of the most difficult aspects for us to grasp, especially when we are facing challenges that seem unrelenting. We often question why God allows certain things to happen or why He doesn't act sooner. But we must remember that God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own expectations. This truth is essential to our faith as it teaches us to trust in His wisdom and to surrender our own understanding of how things should unfold. Consider the example of the Israelites in captivity in Egypt. For generations they cried out to God for deliverance, yet it took hundreds of years before God raised up Moses to lead them out of slavery. Why the delay? Why the long wait? It is impossible for us to fully understand, but one thing is certain: God's timing was perfect. When the time had come, He acted. The deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt was not an accident or a random event. It was the fulfillment of God's promise, and it happened exactly when it was supposed to happen, according to His divine plan. We may not understand why we are in a waiting season or why things take longer than we expect, but we can trust that God is at work behind the scenes, preparing us for what is ahead. The difficulty in trusting God's timing often arises because we live in a world that places so much emphasis on immediate results. In the fast-paced society we live in, we are conditioned to expect instant gratification. Whether it's fast food, instant messaging, or on-demand entertainment, we are used to getting what we want when we want it. However, God's kingdom operates on a different timeline, one that is not governed by the clock or the calendar. His purposes are eternal, and His plans unfold according to a timeline that we may not fully understand. This is why it is so important for us to live by faith and not by sight. We must trust that God is always at work, even when we cannot see the results. In fact, sometimes the waiting period is the most important part of God's plan. During these times, He is working in us, refining our character, strengthening our faith, and preparing us for what is to come. As we learn to trust God's timing, we also learn to trust His wisdom in how He works behind the scenes. God's ways are not our ways, and His thoughts are higher than ours. We may think we know what is best, but we must acknowledge that God's wisdom far exceeds our understanding. His plan is perfect, and He is always working to bring about the best possible outcome for us, even when it doesn't seem that way in the moment. Sometimes we want God to act according to our own desires or timetable, but we must remember that His wisdom is perfect. His plan is far greater than what we can imagine, and it will always result in good for those who love Him. The Apostle Paul reminds us in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Even when we face difficult circumstances or delays, we can take comfort in knowing that God is using those situations for our ultimate good. He is working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail according to His perfect wisdom. Finally, the truth that God is working behind the scenes should fill us with hope. When we feel overwhelmed by life's challenges, we must remember that God is not passive. He is active and engaged in every detail of our lives. Even when we cannot see what He is doing, we can trust that He is working. We may never fully understand the reasons behind our trials or the timing of our deliverance, but we can rest assured that God is always at work and He is always good. Our hope is not in our ability to control our circumstances or in our understanding of God's plan, but in His unchanging faithfulness. He has promised to never leave us or forsake us, and He is always working for our good and His glory. In the midst of uncertainty, we can trust that God is at work, and that gives us hope to continue moving forward. In the end, we are reminded that God's work behind the scenes is a reality we must embrace with both faith and patience. Even when we cannot see His hand at work, He is orchestrating every detail of our lives with infinite wisdom and love. Our finite understanding cannot grasp the vastness of His plan, but His promises are sure, and His timing is perfect. Every trial, every moment of waiting, every unanswered prayer is part of the larger tapestry He is weaving for His glory and our good. We may not always understand the path we are walking, but we can trust that He is guiding us with the same care and sovereignty that has shaped the universe from the beginning. In those moments when we feel overwhelmed, discouraged, or lost, let us hold firm to the truth that God is at work. His purposes are not thwarted by our circumstances, and He is always present, working behind the scenes to bring about His perfect will. Whether we are in the midst of triumph or trial, we can find peace in knowing that we are not alone. Our God is faithful, He is sovereign, and He is working in ways that will ultimately bring glory to His name and joy to our hearts. So let us walk by faith, trust in His timing, and rest in the assurance that He is always working, even when we cannot see it.